proofs for existence of God, this is part of the air that you breathe. You just know yourself so well. And you've been on the show many times, and we've dived into all different aspects of proofs for existence of God, demonstrating God from all sorts of angles. But, there's one thing they all have in common besides what they try to prove. They tend to be a bit complex and unwieldy, unless you're very careful.
Indeed. Importantly, especially for your listeners, Gary, is how can we help people to articulate the general thrust or the general insight of these arguments in a way that is effective, that is distilled but not diluted? And I've made several attempts. I think I'm making progress, along these lines. As you say, these arguments, like anything in philosophy, have a ton of technical detail. But I do believe at the end of the day that their general insight is something that we can express in a fairly simple way and hopefully be able to use it in everyday apologetic conversation. So
technical terminology is meant to be shorthand, right? It's supposed to be a means of summary.
Yeah.
But, the problem with jargon is it also puts you at distance of people that aren't familiar with the jargon. So there is a sweet spot, I imagine, between using technical terms and summarizing things.
Yeah, there is. So whenever you do use a technical term, for example, something like contingent, and you're in the literature, you realize, okay, there's a reason that this term is there. It serves its purpose, but it's not something that if you just throw out in everyday conversation, somebody's going to have an immediate understanding of exactly what you mean. So, sometimes just using a simpler term is effective if you can do that without losing the critical meaning.
In some cases, you kind of already have to have a metaphysical structure to use the argument within, right? It's not like you could walk into someone who is operating on totally different metaphysics and it makes sense to them, right?
Yeah, that's right. There's often a lot when it comes to arguments for the existence of God, or really a lot of different things, that just assumes a certain philosophical background, a set of kind of wider or broader commitments that somebody may or may not be aware of. And to really get a particular argument to run and for somebody to understand it, you have to make sure that they're already in and seeing through that particular paradigm. If they're not, then the argument may not make any sense. It may not be effective, or it may not just be understood. So all these are just complications on stuff that's already kind of complicated, but we don't have to be skeptics. There's still ways we can present good reasons and evidence for the existence of God, that we don't have to, look at all these complications and throw our hands up and just, be like, well, why bother? No, we can still do some cool stuff in simple ways.
Yep. And of course, the other end of the spectrum, you don't want to simplify it so much that it turns out being a bad argument, right? I mean, you got to leave the teeth there so that it actually proves what you want to prove.
Yeah, or frame it in a way that makes it more susceptible to challenge than is necessary. So I did this series with Catholic Answers recently. It was a 2-part series where they actually asked me to do this, Gary. They said, hey, we've got this conference coming up on the existence of God. Can you give us 5 arguments that are so simple even an idiot could understand them? it's like I don't know how low I can bring it, but I'll do my best. So they ran it. So I guess they thought it was simple enough. So I gave 5 presentations of arguments that I think are ultimately pretty good.
Sounds great. Well, why don't we start with contingency?
Yeah, so we've talked about this quite a bit before, and I know we've gone in depth with it. So let's just see if we can just kind of summarize the general thrust. I kind of like to say, okay, what is like the grand insight here for philosophers that have found this argument convincing, maybe even compelling? Like, what is it about this argument that really just, lights up their intellect, right, and pushes them towards theism? And it's really this, in the simplest terms, Gary, it's really this. Any argument, really a cosmological argument for the existence of God, is really just saying, hey, look, there's a bunch of stuff that we encounter that isn't the right sort of stuff that could ever explain itself, right? All this stuff is such that it's always pointing beyond itself for some sort of ultimately causal explanation. And now, one of these approaches is to focus on stuff that is contingent. Now, there's that somewhat technical term, and a contingent reality, broadly speaking, is just anything that is, but need not have been. It's something that it exists, like this coffee cup, but it didn't have to exist. There's nothing about its nature that demands that it be included in reality. Now, most people are just totally willing to grant that there's at least some contingent stuff, right? So it seems a very secure starting point. And what the cosmological reasoner is up to is saying, hey, this sort of feature of the world, whatever it is, we're focusing on contingency now, is not the sort of thing that could ever give a completely adequate explanation of itself, right? Contingency as a sort of fact of the world, if you will, is not a self-explanatory fact. How could it be, right? Because it's the sort of thing it is, but it didn't have to be. So what determines it to be? Why is it here rather than not? And all the cosmological arguments typically go like this. They identify a category like contingency, something that seems to invite a bunch of why questions, specifically, why is it, that cannot in principle answer that question sort of from within its own restrictions or category, right? So the simple and I think obvious move is just to shift the category, right? If contingency can't explain contingency, well, what could? And the answer there, as philosophers have argued, is, well, if something isn't contingent, it must be necessary. These seem to be the sort of exhaustive options here. And a necessary reality would be something whose nature would be very special. It would be something whose nature somehow guaranteed its inclusion into reality. It'd be the sort of thing that could not exist. And when we think about it, this seems to actually make a good bit of sense of the data of contingency, right? So here's a little thought experiment. If you just think of sort of everything that exists, just collectively, whatever it is, we don't have to know everything that exists to just be able to conceive of just a complete collection of everything that does exist, right? And then we kind of ask, well, could anything have sort of caused that complete collection or blob of everything? And the answer is no. And we can know that through just definition and logic, because beyond a complete collection of everything is nothing, and nothing to sort of act as cause, right? Now, this is sort of this invites an interesting paradox, because on one hand, we see a whole bunch of stuff that exists in a contingent and dependent way. It is, but it didn't have to be there. It's caused to exist. But when we zoom out as far as possible, we realize that there's something that exists independently. Maybe there's like two layers or two aspects. There's this contingent layer, which we're really familiar with, but then kind of deeper down or higher up, depending how you look at it, there's this necessary layer, or this being that just exists in a radically different and more robust way. It's a sort of thing that could not fail to exist. And then somehow that sort of necessary foundation gave rise to all the contingent stuff that we see. And that to me just is a really nice theory. It's a really way of just, I think, making more intuitive what the argument from contingency is up to. And then theism kind of slides in there really well. Most people, for various independent reasons, think that whatever else God is, he's sort of absolutely supreme and absolutely perfect, which would seem to entail necessary existence anyway. But the other nice consideration with theism is that it helps answer the question of, well, how do you get contingency from necessity, right? How do you get a sort of a realm of contingent stuff that is but didn't have to be from a realm that did have to be? And I think the best and easiest answer here is that bottom layer, that necessary reality, has something like the power of choice, the power of creative freedom. So that way it chose to create a certain world, a certain collection of things, but it didn't have to. And it's in that choice that we're able to preserve these deep intuitions that we have of contingency, of this realm of things that are but need not have been. Now, of course, to have choice, you must have intellect and will. So that immediately gives you reason to think that necessary reality is at least analogously a being like us, not embodied, of course, but possessed of intellect and will, which of course theists are happy to endorse. Yeah. So I think that does essentially get to the root of the contingency argument. It really does solve a lot of problems and avoids some kind of strange paradoxes. Especially brute facts that, well, we don't have to be here, but we are, and that's just the way it is, which is really not an explanation. Yeah, so framing it like that way, and it was obviously presented in a very conversational way, we can come back to the brute facts thing in a minute, but that type of framing avoids, I think, numerous issues. One is the kind of infinite regress objection. Well, why couldn't there be an infinite regress of contingent things? And framing it in this way kind of leaves that open. Well, maybe there could be. It would just be irrelevant. Now, I think it's in certain causal series, it's impossible. But the way that this argument is set up is we can just go to Leibniz, who says, well, consider an infinite, chain of geometry books where one was copied from the one previous and so on and so forth. Does that, really give us an adequate explanation of why there are geometry books? And Leibniz says no, because we still want an explanation of why that entire chain is there, even if it's stretched out, infinitely, and why it's geometry rather than, say, biochemistry or something like that, right? So we still have those intelligibility restrictions around contingency that don't just go away because we, extend the line of contingency infinitely. So it's irrelevant. Even if there are an infinite number of contingent things, and no matter how they're arranged, there's still very good reason to posit a sort of necessary being either within or without that contingent series to give us a more robust and adequate explanation for it. Now, concerning brute facts, because somebody might say, well, maybe it's just we just get to some contingent thing, we get to some turtle or some turkey, and that's it. That's where we end our explanation. And that turtle or turkey is there, or an electron or whatever, and that's all there is to it. And there's a lot to be said about that, but the simplest thing I would say is this. Look, all other things equal, if we can, go for even just a conceivable explanation, that's far better than going for no explanation. The idea of expect an explanation or explain things as far as you can is really the sort of driving rational principle behind all science and philosophy anyways. And to just arbitrarily abandon that principle, particularly because it seems to be verging upon theism, seems extremely contrived and extremely irrational.